Imagine being a soldier captured on the brutal, starving battlefields of North Africa or France, only to be shipped across the Atlantic and handed a cold bottle of beer and a plate of sizzling steak. While the rest of the world was crumbling under the weight of famine and destruction, nearly 400,000 German prisoners of war were living a life in the United States that many American civilians could only dream of. These were not the dark, crowded dungeons people expected, but instead, they were clean, organized camps where enemies of the state watched Hollywood movies and earned wages for their labor. Today, we are diving into the shocking and controversial history of the luxury camps of World War II America, exploring how the United States turned its greatest enemies into its most comfortable guests through a combination of industrial wealth and strategic hospitality that would change the course of history forever. The journey for a German soldier from the scorched, blood-stained sands of North Africa or the frozen, desolate ruins of the Eastern Front to the shores of the United States was not merely a physical relocation, but a profound psychological shattering of everything they believed to be true about the world. As these thousands of men from the legendary Afrika Korps were marched onto massive transport ships, the prevailing sentiment among the ranks was one of absolute terror, as Nazi propaganda had meticulously painted a picture of an America that was collapsing under the weight of its own internal racial conflicts and the devastating power of German U-boats. Many of these young men, who had never traveled beyond their small German villages before the war, genuinely expected to find New York City in total ruins, imagining a landscape of smoldering craters and starving civilians following the supposed success of the Luftwaffe's transatlantic missions. However, as the transport ships slowly bypassed the majestic Statue of Liberty and glided into the bustling, vibrant ports of the East Coast, the prisoners were met with a sight that felt like a fever dream or a cruel hallucination. Instead of a broken nation, they saw a skyline of towering skyscrapers that seemed to touch the heavens, streets filled with thousands of gleaming automobiles that showed no signs of fuel shortages, and a civilian population that looked remarkably healthy, well-dressed, and indifferent to the horrors of the war-consuming Europe. The shock only deepened once they were loaded onto modern, comfortable trains with cushioned seats and large windows, embarking on a cross-country journey through the vast, untouched expanses of the American heartland. For days, the German soldiers stared in silence at the endless fields of wheat, the massive industrial factories operating at full capacity, and the small towns where life seemed to continue with a terrifying level of normalcy and abundance. They began to realize, with a mixture of awe and growing resentment toward their own leadership, that they had been lied to on a monumental scale, as the weak and decadent America they were promised was clearly an industrial titan that had barely begun to flex its muscles. By the time the trains reached the rural destinations in states like Texas, Kansas, or Mississippi, the psychological defenses of the prisoners had already begun to crumble. Upon arrival at the camps, they were not met with the barbed wire execution squads they feared, but rather by American officers who followed the Geneva Convention with a level of bureaucratic precision that was almost insulting to men who had just come from the lawless brutality of the front lines. They were ushered into clean, spacious barracks equipped with indoor plumbing, hot showers, and electric lighting, luxuries that many German homes didn't even possess at the time. Are you enjoying this deep dive? Most people don't know this side of the war. If you're one of the few who values true history, subscribe now and help us grow this archive. The administration of nearly 500 camps scattered across the vast American landscape was not merely a military task, but a massive bureaucratic experiment in the strict application of international law. When the United States entered the war, the government was determined to follow every single line of the Geneva Convention of 1929, not necessarily out of pure kindness, but as a strategic shield to protect American soldiers who might fall into German hands. This meant that the life of a German prisoner was governed by a set of rules so precise that they covered everything from the exact square footage of their sleeping quarters to the number of calories required in every single meal. Each camp functioned as a self-contained ecosystem where the German military hierarchy was often allowed to remain partially intact, meaning that German non-commissioned officers were frequently responsible for the internal discipline and daily management of their own men under American supervision. The barracks were constructed with high-quality timber and insulation, ensuring that the soldiers remained warm during the harsh American winters and cool during the blistering summers of the South, a stark contrast to the makeshift, freezing dugouts they had inhabited in the Soviet Union. The German soldiers found this American obsession with rules and paperwork to be utterly baffling as they were issued identification cards. Fingerprints were taken with clinical precision, and they were given a small monthly allowance in camp currency. The Americans even allowed the Germans to elect their own camp spokesman, usually a high-ranking officer, who acted as a liaison between the prisoners and the American commandant. By turning the prison experience into a highly regulated, predictable, and even comfortable routine, the United States military managed to neutralize thousands of dangerous combatants using paper, ink, and fair treatment rather than the traditional methods of iron bars and starvation, creating an environment where the barbed wire disease, a psychological breakdown common in prisoners, was virtually non-existent. Inside the barbed wire of the American camps, a different kind of war was being waged, a war for the hearts and minds of the German soldiers through the medium of culture, entertainment, and intellectual liberation. The American authorities realized very early on that bored soldiers are dangerous soldiers, so they encouraged an incredible array of artistic activities that transformed the camps into temporary centers of German culture in the middle of the American wilderness. Every camp had a theater or a large hall where prisoners organized elaborate stage plays, often sewing their own costumes from old blankets and painting sophisticated backdrops with smuggled supplies. The musical talent within the German ranks was immense, and with instruments provided by organizations like the YMCA, they formed professional-level orchestras that performed the works of Wagner, Beethoven, and Bach. These performances were so high in quality that American guards often traded shifts just to be able to sit in the back and listen to the music, creating a strange, temporary peace where the music bridged the gap between captor and captive. However, the most powerful tool of influence was the Hollywood movie. The U.S. government regularly screened American films for the prisoners, carefully selecting movies that showcased the wealth, freedom, and casual lifestyle of the United States. While the Nazi leadership had spent years telling these men that America was a land of poverty and racial chaos, the silver screen showed them a world of neon lights, overflowing grocery stores, and people who spoke their minds without fear of the Gestapo. This led to a fascinating cultural shock, where young Germans began to adopt American slang, started playing baseball in the camp courtyards, and developed a taste for American jazz, which the Nazi regime had banned as degenerate music. The educational programs were equally vast, with many camps offering courses in American history and government, aiming to denazify the prisoners without them even realizing it. They were given access to newspapers from across the political spectrum, allowing them for the first time in their lives to read contrasting opinions and realize the power of a free press and individual thought. One of the most explosive and publicly debated issues during the entire history of the German prisoner of war program in America was the incredible disparity between the diet of the captives and the increasingly restricted rations of the American civilian population. Under the strict legal framework of the Geneva Convention, the United States was obligated to feed prisoners of war the same caloric intake as its own domestic troops. But in the land of abundance, this meant that German soldiers were being served meals that were far superior to what they had received even in the highest ranks of the German army. While the average American mother was standing in long lines with government-issued stamps just to buy a few ounces of sugar, butter, or a small cut of meat, the German prisoners were sitting down to 3 hot meals a day that featured thick steaks, fresh poultry, white bread, and an endless supply of fresh milk and vegetables. The controversy reached a boiling point when local newspapers began publishing menus from the camps, showing that German prisoners were enjoying Thanksgiving turkeys and holiday hams while American families were being asked to sacrifice for the war effort. The canteen system added fuel to this public resentment, as prisoners were allowed to earn canteen scrip by performing labor, which they could then spend on luxury items that were becoming rare for civilians, such as premium chocolate, cigarettes, and even light beer. It was a common sight to see a German soldier, who months earlier might have been shooting at American boys in North Africa, standing in a camp store choosing between different brands of American soda and tobacco. The political pressure on the Roosevelt administration was immense, leading to several congressional investigations into whether the government was coddling the Nazis. But the military leadership remained firm in its belief that treating prisoners well was the best way to ensure that American prisoners in Germany were treated with similar humanity. As the American military machine expanded to millions of men fighting overseas, a critical labor shortage began to threaten the United States' agricultural output, leading to the decision to integrate German prisoners into the domestic economy. Across the vast farmlands of the Midwest and the South, thousands of German soldiers were dispatched to work alongside American civilians, helping to harvest cotton, corn, and sugar beets. In these rural settings, the propaganda of both nations began to dissolve in the face of shared human labor as American farm families began to see the young German men not as ideological monsters, but as hard-working boys who were far away from their own homes. There are countless historical accounts of German prisoners being invited into farm kitchens to share a noon meal, where they were exposed to the warmth of American domestic life and the sheer diversity of a country they had been told was a fractured and dying society. However, when the war finally ended in May 1945, the prospect of repatriation was no longer a dream of returning home, but a nightmare of returning to a landscape of rubble, starvation, and Soviet occupation. Many prisoners were so desperate to stay in America that they petitioned the government for citizenship or attempted to escape and blend into the small towns where they had worked, preferring a life as a fugitive in America over a life as a free man in the ruins of Germany. Upon their eventual return, these former prisoners often became the most reliable supporters of the post-war reconstruction, sharing stories of the land of plenty, where they had been treated with dignity even as enemies. The legacy of these luxury camps lives on as a testament to the idea that the most enduring victories are not won on the battlefield with steel and fire, but in the hearts and minds of the defeated through the overwhelming power of humanity and prosperity. The story of the German prisoners of war in America remains one of the most remarkable and under-discussed chapters of the Second World War, serving as a testament to a time when a nation chose to uphold its values even in the face of total conflict. The decision to treat nearly 400,000 enemies with a level of care that sparked national outrage was a gamble that ultimately paid dividends for decades to come, proving that the humanitarian path can often be the most strategically sound. These men arrived as prisoners of war, but they left as ambassadors of a new world order, carrying the seeds of democracy back to a continent that had been nearly consumed by darkness. As we look back at this unique historical moment, we are reminded that even in the midst of the most violent struggle in human history, there was a place where the enemy was met not with a brute force, but with a plate of food and a chance to see a different way of life. Thank you for joining us for this extensive look at the untold history of German POWs in America. If you found this narrative compelling and wish to see more deep dives into our history, please subscribe to the channel and share your thoughts in the comments below. Thank you for spending this time here. If these quiet, true World War II stories matter to you, Subscribing helps this channel continue.